Hello. Today we're diving into the most intense moment of the story. Everything seemed lost, but now, a chance for salvation appears on the horizon. However, this will not be the rescue you expected. Get ready for a shocking situation that will leave you in horror. But before you get comfortable, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always interesting to see who has joined us. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. Jonathan Brooks was a young cop, serving in a small American town that hadn't seen much action for years. His days were filled with the same monotony, patrolling the streets, issuing minor tickets, and dealing with trivial disturbances. He had entered the force with hopes of making a difference, but now, a few years into his career, the job felt less like a calling and more like a dead end. He'd always dreamed of being a hero, but that dream had long been crushed by the unremarkable realities of law enforcement. His salary was decent, but it wasn't enough to live the life he imagined when he was young and idealistic. Jonathan had a small apartment, an old car, and few friends outside the police force. He had no family, no one to share his struggles with. The weight of his choices began to suffocate him, and he found himself starting to justify the little shortcuts that crept into his work. It was a Thursday evening when everything changed. Jonathan had just finished his shift and was heading home when he noticed a car parked near an abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. The parking lot was empty, and the car was oddly out of place. As he slowed down, he saw two men standing by the vehicle, speaking in hushed tones, occasionally glancing around nervously. The moment he saw a large duffel bag being pulled from the trunk, something inside him clicked. He knew what was in that bag before it even hit the ground: drugs. Jonathan had been a cop long enough to recognize the telltale signs of a drug deal, even if it was the first time he'd seen one firsthand. He pulled his car into a side street, the darkness hiding his presence. For several moments, he watched them unload what looked like bundles of something wrapped in plastic. His mind raced. This was the big break he'd been waiting for. He had always dreamed of busting a major operation, of showing his worth to the higher-ups. But what was happening now? It wasn't a bust. It was an opportunity. He knew what he should do. He could call in a report, let his colleagues handle it. But something stopped him. In his mind, the thought played over and over. What if this was his chance to stand out? What if this was how he could finally prove himself, climb the ranks, and leave behind the life he was stuck in? Jonathan wrestled with his conscience. It was only for a moment, a fleeting instant, but it felt like time had stopped. The temptation to do something more, to act, was overwhelming. Without thinking further, he made a decision. He drove a few blocks away and parked his car. His mind raced, filled with conflicting thoughts. He couldn't stop himself. He had to do this. Jonathan returned to the parking lot, his heart pounding in his chest. His plan, though hasty, was simple. He would plant the drugs in the trunk of a car he knew was parked there earlier, belonging to a local troublemaker. The man had a criminal record, always stirring up trouble in the area. If the drugs were found in his vehicle, Jonathan would be seen as the officer who cracked a major drug deal wide open. It was a perfect setup, a way to get his foot in the door and perhaps even earn that elusive promotion. Jonathan snuck up to the man's car, checking to ensure no one was watching. He opened the trunk, his hands shaking as he placed the bags inside. It felt wrong, but in the back of his mind he justified it. He had to do this. He needed this. No one would know, right? It was a victimless crime after all. He closed the trunk and stepped back. The adrenaline was surging through him. For a moment he felt invincible, like he had just outsmarted the system. He took out his phone and dialed in an anonymous tip, reporting the suspicious activity at the warehouse. Then, he vanished into the night, blending into the shadows. The next morning, Jonathan's phone rang. It was his sergeant, the familiar voice on the other end filled with excitement. "You won't believe it, Brooks," the sergeant said. "They found a huge stash in that car. This could be it, a real bust. They're gonna want to talk to you." "Well done, son." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, trying to mask the nervousness bubbling inside him. He had done it. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. He knew that. But hearing the praise from his sergeant, the congratulations from his colleagues, made him feel like he was finally part of something bigger. This was the breakthrough he needed. Or so he told himself. As the days passed, the praise continued to flow. Jonathan was called into the captain's office, where Captain Clyde Harris handed him a commendation for his outstanding work. "You did good, Brooks," Harris said, shaking his hand firmly. "We don't get many wins like this around here. This could be the start of something big for you." But even as Jonathan accepted the accolades, a strange feeling gnawed at him. Deep down, he knew the truth. He had cheated to get here. It wasn't the first time he had compromised his integrity for a promotion or a reward. But this felt different. The guilt was there, lingering in the back of his mind. But for now, Jonathan pushed it aside. The praise, the attention, the sense of accomplishment were too intoxicating to ignore. Still, a part of him knew. The deeper he went, the harder it would be to turn back. Days turned into weeks, and Jonathan's life began to shift in ways he hadn't expected. The accolades for his supposed bust had kept coming, and even his colleagues were beginning to treat him differently. He had become the golden boy of the department, the one who cracked the big case. His name was whispered in the corridors with admiration, and even Captain Clyde Harris started taking him under his wing, giving him more responsibility and more opportunities. The prize he had been seeking seemed to be in his grasp, but beneath the surface, something was changing in him. At first, Jonathan was elated. He felt powerful, respected, like he was finally on the right path. His paycheck was higher now, his reputation was better, and he even began to receive more attention from people outside of the department. He spent less time at home and more time at bars, trying to savor his newfound popularity. But the initial rush of success began to fade, and it was replaced by a gnawing emptiness. It was subtle at first, but it was there, a constant reminder that something was wrong. The dark corner of his mind, where the seed of doubt had been planted, kept whispering to him. Every time he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror, he saw a man he didn't recognize. It was as if his identity was slowly slipping away, replaced by the man he had to become to survive in the world he had chosen. A man willing to cut corners, to take risks, and to make deals with his conscience. Jonathan tried to push the feeling aside, telling himself that he had done what needed to be done. He had made a choice to succeed, to rise above the mundane. But deep down, he knew that the cost of that choice was slowly eroding his soul. It wasn't long before the pressure began to take its toll. Jonathan had always been a man who prided himself on his discipline, but now, the cracks in his armor were becoming visible. He started drinking more, staying up late, unable to quiet his racing thoughts. The nightmares began soon after. They were vivid, disturbing dreams where he was trapped in the very warehouse where he had planted the drugs, surrounded by the faceless figures of those who had been affected by his actions. His mind replayed this moment over and over. The bags of drugs slipping into the trunk, the lie he had told, the innocence he had destroyed. The guilt was suffocating. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the man whose life he had ruined, the local drug dealer who had been arrested and subsequently found dead in his cell. The man had died under mysterious circumstances, an apparent suicide. But to Jonathan, it felt like murder. The drugs he had planted in that car had set off a chain of events that had led to the man's tragic death. And now, Jonathan was left to deal with the consequences of his actions, though no one could see it but him. Captain Harris had taken notice of Jonathan's changing behavior, but he attributed it to the pressure of the job. He was a seasoned cop, and he knew that the thrill of a big bust could lead to burnout. He called Jonathan into his office one afternoon, offering him some words of encouragement. "You're doing great, Brooks, but don't let it get to you. You've been pushing hard, and it's taking a toll. Take a step back. Take a breather. There's no shame in that." Jonathan nodded, but the words didn't sink in. He could feel the weight of Harris's gaze, as though the older officer knew more than he was letting on. He was probably right. Jonathan was pushing too hard, but he couldn't stop. The need for validation, the hunger for more, consumed him. He had already crossed one line. What was a few more? The next few weeks were a blur. Jonathan became more reckless in his work, more careless in his personal life. He continued drinking, staying out late with his colleagues, and ignoring the growing dissonance in his mind. His relationships began to crumble. Friends who had once respected him started to distance themselves. His neighbors, who had once greeted him with friendly smiles, now looked at him with suspicion. The discontent that had started as a whisper now screamed in his ears. One evening, after a particularly hard day, Jonathan found himself at a bar, staring into his glass of whiskey, trying to drown out the voices in his head. He didn't want to think about what he had done, didn't want to confront the reality of it, but there was no escape. The memories of the drug deal, the body in the cell, the man he had betrayed, kept clawing at him. He looked up, his gaze locking onto the face of a man across the bar. It was someone he didn't recognize at first, but then it hit him. The man was a former associate of the drug dealer who had been arrested in the sting. The realization struck like a punch to the gut. "Hey," Jonathan called out, his voice hoarse. "I know you." The man stared back at him, his face hard and unreadable. You're the cop who set it up, aren't you? The words stung, but Jonathan couldn't deny them. I didn't. But the man cut him off. You don't need to lie, cop. We know. We've been watching. Jonathan's heart raced. He had been so careful, so meticulous, or so he thought. But now, in the dim light of the bar, he realized how foolish he had been. The world he had entered wasn't a simple one. There were consequences to every action, every lie. And the people who ran this world, they always knew. I didn't mean for it to go down like this, Jonathan muttered, his voice breaking. The man didn't reply, but the look in his eyes was enough. It was a look that said everything, that Jonathan had crossed a line from which there was no return. When Jonathan left the bar that night, the weight of the man's words hung over him like a storm cloud. The world felt heavier now, more dangerous. He realized, too late, that he had been playing a game he didn't understand, a game where the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. And now, with every step he took, he was moving closer to the edge, a place from which he might never come back. His nightmares grew worse. The faces of the dead, the men and women whose lives he had ruined, began to haunt him during the day too. It was as though they were all waiting for him to pay for his sins. And Jonathan knew, deep down, that he was on the brink of losing himself. But there was no escape, not anymore. Weeks passed since Jonathan's fateful encounter in the bar, and things had only gotten worse. The pressure was mounting, and it was becoming harder to keep the pieces of his life together. His colleagues noticed the change. The once confident and eager cop was now distant, irritable, and often distracted. Jonathan wasn't fooling anyone, least of all himself. He was unraveling. At work, he could no longer concentrate. Every conversation felt like a lie. Every case seemed irrelevant compared to the chaos inside his mind. He couldn't look at his colleagues without feeling like a fraud. And every time his captain patted him on the back and praised his quick thinking during the drug bust, Jonathan's stomach churned. It was all a farce. He was living a lie, and he couldn't escape it. One day, Jonathan sat in his patrol car, parked in an empty lot, staring at the dashboard. The ticking of the clock on the dashboard sounded like an ominous countdown to something he couldn't avoid. He had begun to lose his grip on reality. The once familiar world now seemed alien to him, and he was trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. He was caught in the web he had spun himself, the false promise of success, the hollow validation from his peers, and the deep, gnawing guilt that kept him up at night. He had been avoiding calls from his old friends, the few people who still cared about him. They didn't know the real Jonathan anymore, the man who had made an unforgivable choice. He couldn't face them, couldn't tell them what he had done, couldn't bear to see the disappointment in their eyes. And so, he kept his distance, burying himself in the chaos of his own mind. The tipping point came one late afternoon. Jonathan had been assigned to a routine case, a simple domestic dispute, nothing out of the ordinary. But as he arrived at the address, something felt wrong. The air was thick with tension, and the moment he stepped inside the house, he could feel the weight of something sinister. His gut told him that this wasn't just a simple fight between a husband and wife. There was more to it. The man who had called in the complaint was standing in the living room, visibly shaken. He kept glancing at the door, as though expecting someone to burst in. Jonathan had seen that kind of fear before, the kind that only came when someone knew they were in over their head. The man began to explain the situation, but Jonathan wasn't listening. His mind kept drifting back to the conversation in the bar, to the faces of the dead, and to the constant weight of guilt that had been suffocating him for weeks. "You're not safe here," the man said, his voice cracking. "They're going to come for me. I know they are." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "Who?" he asked, his voice flat. The man hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. I can't say. But they know what I did, and they know about you too." The words hit Jonathan like a slap to the face. He recoiled, a chill running down his spine. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising in anger. But the man's eyes were already darting toward the door, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He had to know the truth, had to understand why the man was so terrified. But before he could ask another question, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside cut him off. Jonathan turned toward the window, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. The door to the house slammed open, and 3 men stormed inside. They were all dressed in black, their faces concealed by masks. Jonathan's training kicked in, but it was too late. The men were too fast. Before he could draw his weapon, one of them grabbed him from behind and slammed him to the ground. The other two men quickly overpowered the terrified homeowner, who was now pleading for his life. "Shut him up," one of the men ordered coldly. Jonathan struggled against the grip of the man holding him down, but it was no use. He was trapped. He had no idea who these men were, but the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. These were the people he had unwittingly crossed. The shadows he had tried to ignore had found him, and now there would be no escape. As one of the masked men began to approach the homeowner with a crowbar, Jonathan's mind raced. His body was shaking with adrenaline, but he couldn't think straight. The guilt, the fear, the regret, it all hit him like a tidal wave. His choices had led him here, and now he was paying the price. His desperation grew as he realized he was powerless to stop what was happening. All he could do was watch as the violence unfolded before him. Then, the door to the house burst open again, and a group of police officers rushed in, guns drawn. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he thought he was saved. But as he looked up at his fellow officers, he saw their faces, hard, cold, unreadable. They weren't here to help. They were here to clean up the mess he had made. They were part of the same world that had swallowed him whole. The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. He wasn't a hero. He was a pawn in a much larger game, and now that game had come to claim him. Later that night, Jonathan sat in his patrol car, staring blankly at the dashboard once again. The incident at the house had been a wake-up call, but it had only made things worse. The men who had attacked the homeowner had disappeared without a trace, and the police officers who had arrived on the scene had acted as if nothing had happened. It was as though the whole thing had been orchestrated, part of a plan he couldn't understand. His mind was a fog of confusion and fear. The pieces weren't fitting together anymore. The world that had seemed so clear, so simple, was now a twisted maze that he could no longer navigate. And all the while, the guilt gnawed at him, growing stronger with each passing day. Jonathan knew that he had crossed a line, but he didn't know how to turn back. The darkness was closing in, and there was no way out. Jonathan's life was spiraling out of control, and he couldn't stop it. He thought the events at the house, the masked men, the terror, the realization that he was nothing more than a pawn in a world of shadowy figures, had been the worst of it. But things were only just beginning to get worse. The feeling of inevitability was sinking in, and it felt like the walls were closing in on him from all sides. It had been a week since the incident, and he hadn't been able to get a good night's sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the events of that day replayed in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of the masked men, the homeowner's pleading, the helplessness in his own chest. The feeling that he was drowning in his own mistakes was becoming all-consuming. And yet, he couldn't stop. The choices he had made, the deals he had struck, had led him to this point, and there was no way out. His colleagues had stopped asking him how he was doing, or even acknowledging him much at all. They didn't want to know. They didn't want to see the cracks in the facade, the toll that everything was taking on him. The longer he stayed in the force, the more he realized that no one could truly understand what he was going through. No one cared. They were just as trapped as he was, playing the same game, living the same lies. Jonathan tried to push everything down, to keep moving forward, but the weight of his guilt was too much. It felt like a 100-pound anchor, dragging him deeper and deeper with every breath. He couldn't look at his reflection in the mirror anymore. He didn't recognize the person staring back at him. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. There was a dullness in them, a deadness that hadn't been there before. He had lost himself somewhere along the way, and he didn't know how to find his way back. It was late one night when Jonathan received a call that sent a chill down his spine. He had been sitting in his car, parked near the edge of the city, trying to clear his mind. But the moment the phone rang, he felt the familiar tension return. "Brooks, we need you," the voice on the other end said. It was his captain, Clyde Harris. There was urgency in his tone, something that made Jonathan sit up straight, despite the exhaustion in his bones. "What's going on, Captain?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're gonna want to see this," Harris replied. "It's about the case. The one you worked on. The one with the bust. We've got a situation, and it involves you. Get here now." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the blood draining from his face as he hung up the phone. His palms were clammy, his fingers trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. He knew this moment was coming. He knew that, sooner or later, his lies would catch up with him. The question was no longer if, but when. He started the car and drove to the station, the dark street stretching before him like an endless, oppressive void. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but all he could see were the mistakes that lay in his past, the choices that had led him here. The truth was closing in on him, and he was powerless to stop it. When Jonathan arrived at the station, Captain Harris was waiting for him in his office. The door was closed, and there was a heaviness in the air that made Jonathan feel like he was about to face his reckoning. "Sit down," Harris said, motioning to the chair across from his desk. Jonathan sat, his body tense, his mind racing. He couldn't keep his eyes still. His gaze darted around the room, avoiding Harris's steady, watchful eyes. Harris didn't waste any time. "We've got a problem," he began. "The drug bust you were involved in. There are questions. Serious ones." Jonathan's stomach churned. "What kind of questions?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. "Someone from the higher-ups got wind of something," Harris said, his voice low. "There are whispers about how the bust went down, about your role in it. They're asking a lot of questions, and they want answers." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He had been expecting this, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. His breath quickened, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He had spent weeks trying to bury the truth, but now it was staring him in the face. The guilt, the fear, the consequences, they were all crashing down on him, all at once. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jonathan said, his voice cracking under the strain. "I did my job. I did what was asked of me." Harris didn't respond immediately. He just stared at Jonathan, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "You're not fooling anyone, Brooks," Harris said quietly. "I know what happened. We both know what happened." Jonathan's pulse raced. "You're wrong," he whispered, though deep down, he knew Harris wasn't. The captain's words were like a sharp blade to the chest, cutting through the final remnants of his self-deception. "I'm giving you a chance to come clean," Harris said, his voice cold. "You've got one shot, Jonathan. If you don't come forward now, if you don't tell me what really went down, I won't be able to protect you." Jonathan's mind was a whirlwind. He wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but he was trapped. There was no way out. The walls were closing in on him, and the truth he had tried so hard to bury, was finally catching up with him. The silence in the room was suffocating. It felt like the air had thickened, and Jonathan couldn't breathe. The weight of Harris's words hung heavy in the air, suffocating him with the gravity of what he had done. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now, there was no way back. After what felt like an eternity, Jonathan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake," he said, his throat tight. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. But I planted the drugs." Harris's eyes narrowed slightly, and he leaned back in his chair. "I know," he said simply. "I know." Jonathan's heart sank. The realization that Harris had known all along felt like a punch to the gut. He had thought for a brief moment that he could get away with it, that he could bury the truth deep enough so no one would ever find out. But now, it was all coming to light, and there was no escape. Harris studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You've got two choices now," he said. "You can either take the fall for this and live with the consequences, or you can work with us and help us bring down the people behind this operation. But if you choose to stay silent, if you choose to protect them, then you'll have sealed your own fate." Jonathan's mind spun. He had no idea what to do, where to turn. He was standing at the edge, and he could feel the abyss yawning before him. But as he sat there, staring at Harris, the truth slowly began to sink in. There was no going back. Whatever choice he made now would determine the rest of his life. And just like before, it was a choice he couldn't escape. Jonathan sat across from Captain Harris, the weight of the decision before him pressing down harder than ever. The captain's words lingered in the air, a constant reminder that the moment he had feared had finally arrived. It felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a solid footing. The truth, the horrifying, undeniable truth, had finally come to light, and now he had a choice to make. As he stared at Harris, his mind raced. For a brief, fleeting moment, Jonathan considered the option that had always seemed the easiest: to stay quiet, to lie his way out, to protect himself. It was the coward's way, the route of least resistance. But deep down, he knew that he could never live with himself if he chose that path. He had already gone too far, betrayed too many, and it wasn't just about him anymore. His actions had consequences, and he had to face them. But the other option, to turn on the very people who had played a part in his downfall, felt like a betrayal of a different kind. Jonathan had been in this world long enough to know how dangerous it was. Once you made a deal with the devil, there was no getting out. He had crossed that line, and the people behind the operation weren't people you could walk away from easily. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more he realized how deeply entangled he was in their web. He could feel the sweat gathering on the back of his neck, his heart pounding in his chest. Harris was waiting for him to speak, to make a choice, but Jonathan couldn't find the words. The fear in his gut was suffocating him, and his thoughts were spinning faster and faster. He thought of the drug dealer, the man whose life he had ruined. He thought of the people who had been involved in the operation, the people who had watched him, manipulated him, and used him as a pawn. And he thought of the dead man in the cell, the one whose suicide, if it truly was a suicide, would haunt him forever. Harris leaned forward, his gaze piercing through Jonathan's haze of confusion. "You're running out of time, Brooks," he said quietly. "You can't keep hiding from this. If you don't make a decision, it'll be made for you." Jonathan clenched his fists, his knuckles white. The tension in the room was unbearable, but in that moment, something inside him snapped. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep lying. The weight of it all was too much to bear. I'll help you," he said, his voice strained, barely above a whisper. "But I need your word, Captain. You need to protect me. I can't do this alone. I don't know how to do this." Harris nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'll protect you, Jonathan. But understand this. The people we're dealing with, they don't play by the rules. If you help me, there's no going back. You're in this for the long haul. You have to be ready for that." Jonathan swallowed hard. He had never been more certain of anything in his life, and yet, he had never been more terrified. There was no turning back now. For the next few days, Jonathan did everything he could to gather information. He began working closely with Harris, piecing together the puzzle that had been his life for the past year. He learned about the syndicate behind the drug operation, the people who had used him and others like him to further their own agenda. It was like peeling back the layers of a conspiracy that had been carefully hidden in plain sight. The more he learned, the more disgusted he became. These people weren't just criminals. They were a network of power, influence, and corruption, and they had been operating right under the noses of everyone, including the police. As he worked alongside Harris, Jonathan realized how deeply his own involvement ran. He wasn't just a small player in this game, he was one of the key pieces. He had helped set up the bust, had planted the drugs, had sent the innocent man to his death. He had been manipulated, sure, but in the end, he had made the choice to play along. And now, there was no escaping the consequences. The more Jonathan learned about the syndicate, the more he understood the depth of the danger he was in. These people didn't care about loyalty. They didn't care about the rules. They had money, they had power, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep their operation running smoothly. And now Jonathan was a part of it. He had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went, but he knew one thing for certain. If he was going to survive, he needed to bring them down. The days turned into weeks, and Jonathan's work with Harris grew more intense. Every new piece of information he uncovered made the situation more dire. The syndicate was bigger, more dangerous, and more organized than he had ever imagined. There were players in the highest levels of government, law enforcement, and business, all of them working together to keep the operation running smoothly. And now, they were starting to take notice of Jonathan. One night, after a long day of gathering intel, Jonathan sat alone in his apartment, staring at the wall. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Harris. "We have a lead. Meet me at the warehouse in 30 minutes. Jonathan's stomach tightened. He had been to that warehouse before. It was where everything had started, where his decision had been made. He had hoped that he'd never have to go back there, but now, it seemed inevitable. He grabbed his jacket, his hand trembling as he zipped it up. This could be the moment where everything came to a head. It could be the end of his nightmare, or the beginning of something far worse. He arrived at the warehouse and saw Harris standing in the dim light, waiting for him. There was a look of urgency in the captain's eyes that Jonathan hadn't seen before. Harris didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They're coming for us," he said, his voice low. "We have to move now. They've caught wind of our investigation. They know we're getting close." Jonathan's heart sank. "How close?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Close enough that they're willing to eliminate anyone who stands in their way," Harris replied. "That includes you, Brooks." The words hit Jonathan like a slap to the face. He had known that he was walking a dangerous path, but hearing it from Harris made it all the more real. The people he was up against weren't just criminals. They were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to protect their operation. As Harris spoke, Jonathan felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. His choices had brought him to this point. The lies, the betrayals, the mistakes. They had all led him here, to this moment where his life was hanging by a thread. And now, there was no way out. The warehouse loomed before Jonathan like a silent, watchful beast. It was familiar. A place where his decisions had started this whole chain of events. A place where so many lives had already been lost. Now it felt like the final chapter in his own twisted journey. His heart pounded as he stepped into the dim light, his breath shallow, his thoughts racing. Captain Harris stood by the entrance, his expression grim. "We need to move fast," he said, urgency in his voice. "They're already here, and they're not going to wait around much longer." Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. He didn't know if he was more terrified of the criminals who were closing in on them, or the consequences of everything he had done. Either way, it felt like there was no way out. "Where do we start?" Jonathan asked, his voice hoarse. "We gather what we can, the evidence, the names. We get it all together and take it down. This could be our last shot." Jonathan followed Harris through the dark corridors of the warehouse, the flickering lights above casting long shadows on the walls. Every step felt like a step closer to his inevitable end. He didn't know what was worse, the thought of being caught in the crossfire, or the realization that he might never be able to make up for what he had done. They reached a back room, where a few of their allies were waiting. The team was small, a mix of local officers who had turned on the syndicate and those who had been brought in from outside. Jonathan recognized a few faces, but mostly, he was surrounded by strangers. People who had no idea what he had done, and who probably wouldn't want to know. "This is it," Harris said, his voice steady but strained. "We take them down here. We can't let them get away." Jonathan didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, spinning with the weight of his choices. As much as he wanted to believe in the justice of the mission, the truth was, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had already lost. He had already betrayed too many, done too much to ever come back. Whatever happened now would be the final consequence of the mistakes he had made. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Harris tensed, signaling for everyone to stay silent. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat as he realized they were no longer alone. The people who had been hunting him, the ones who had used him, were finally here. He could feel the air grow thick with tension as they waited, watching the door. Seconds turned to minutes, and then the door suddenly swung open. Two masked men stepped inside, their guns drawn, their eyes scanning the room. Jonathan's instincts kicked in, and he was on the move before anyone could react. He reached for his weapon, his hand trembling as he aimed at the first man. The gunshot rang out in the confined space, the sound deafening. Jonathan had fired, but the man hadn't fallen. He was still standing, glaring at Jonathan with a look of cold indifference. The second man lunged forward, grabbing Jonathan by the arm and throwing him against the wall. Pain exploded in Jonathan's side as his back slammed into the cold concrete, but he didn't stop. He pushed himself to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The men were closing in, but he could hear Harris's voice, shouting orders to the others. He couldn't focus on them right now. He had to survive. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could give him an edge. There, a steel pipe lying on the floor near the back of the room. Without thinking, he grabbed it, swinging it with everything he had. The first man's gun went flying across the room, and the second man was knocked back, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Jonathan's pulse raced as he turned to face Harris and the others. The plan had gone horribly wrong. They were outnumbered, and the warehouse was crawling with people who knew exactly how to fight dirty. The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire and shouting. Jonathan found himself crouched behind a stack of crates, trying to steady his breathing. The chaos felt endless, the adrenaline pounding through his veins like a drug. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, where every moment brought him closer to his own death. Harris emerged from behind cover, firing shots at the masked men as he moved forward. Jonathan wanted to help, to fight back, but his hands felt heavy, his vision blurred. The guilt, the fear, the shame, it all mixed together, a toxic cocktail that made it impossible to think straight. He had done this to himself. He had chosen this, and now there was no way out. Then it happened. A voice, familiar and cold, cut through the chaos. "You're not going anywhere, Brooks." Jonathan's blood ran cold. He turned to see a man step out from the shadows, his face obscured by a black mask. But there was something about the man's posture, his confidence, that made Jonathan's stomach drop. It was one of the higher-ups in the syndicate. He had no idea how the man had found them, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The man was standing between Jonathan and the door, his gun aimed squarely at his chest. "We've been watching you," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You thought you could get away, that you could play both sides. But you were wrong, Brooks. You're ours, and there's no escape." Jonathan's heart thundered in his chest. He had been a fool. He had thought that somehow he could get out of this, that he could fix everything. But now he realized the truth. The moment he had planted those drugs in the car, his life had already been taken from him. He had signed his own death warrant, whether he realized it or not. "You're wrong," Jonathan found himself saying, his voice trembling. "I'm not yours. Not anymore." The man's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" Without warning, Jonathan lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. The gun went off, the bullet missing him by inches as they crashed to the floor. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. Jonathan fought with every ounce of strength he had, struggling to disarm the man. He could feel the cold barrel of the gun pressing into his side, but he didn't stop. He fought for his life, fought for the chance to make things right, even if it was too late. With a final, desperate move, Jonathan wrenched the gun from the man's grip, pointing it directly at his face. "Tell your people it's over," Jonathan said, his voice hoarse, as the man lay at his feet. "Tell them it ends here." The man's eyes flashed with fury. But then, in an unexpected twist, his expression softened, and a cold smile spread across his face. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "This is just the beginning, Brooks. You've sealed your fate." Jonathan didn't answer. He had no words left. With one final pull of the trigger, the man's life ended in an instant. The room fell silent. The gunfire stopped. The chaos came to an abrupt halt. Jonathan stood there, his hands trembling, his chest heaving. The blood was still rushing in his ears, and he could feel the cold sweat dripping down his face. It was over. But even as the warehouse descended into an eerie quiet, Jonathan knew that this was just one battle in a war that he could never win. As the remaining syndicate members retreated into the darkness, Jonathan's legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his mind finally shutting down from the weight of everything he had just done. He had survived, but at what cost?